Out of the 50 Muslim-majority countries in the world, the vast majority have a strict marriage between government and religion. Citizens must abide by Sharia law, women are required to wear hijabs, and religious conversion is criminalized. Did you know, however, that there is one major exception today? The country of Turkey. For much of Turkey's history, Islamic governance and culture has not only been kept out of public life, but at times it has been strictly forbidden. How did this happen and why? Today we are going to talk about Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the father of modern Turkey, who became the first president of the Republic of Turkey after the Ottoman Empire collapsed exactly 100 years ago. In many ways, the United States has benefited from Mustafa Kemal Atatürk's Turkey, but now some Turkish citizens are trying to move away from that legacy. I'm Julie Hartman, and this is Timeless. Hey everyone, welcome to Timeless. I hope that you are having a great week. Just a reminder to hit the subscribe button down below so that you can be notified every time I post a new video, whether that's the Julie Noted news segment or this part of the show, the Timeless Eternal Subject segment. You can also follow me at Julie R. Hartman on Instagram and Twitter. So why are we talking about Turkey today? You all know that I love history. I can talk about any leader, any part of history, and it will be endlessly interesting to me. But why am I choosing this topic now? The answer is that Turkey actually has a pretty big presidential election coming up. I've talked about this in my Julie Noted segment. There is a runoff between the current president, President Erdogan, of the Justice and Development Party, and he is running against an opposition leader, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, who is of the Kemal Atatürk Party, the Republican Party of Turkey, which Kemal Atatürk founded in 1923, so exactly 100 years ago when he came to power. Actually, these two ran against each other in a runoff election a few weeks ago, and no candidate got 50%, which is the required vote percentage in order to win. So they are advancing to a second runoff election that is going to be later this month on May 28th, which will decide who the next president of Turkey is. What's interesting to consider about this election, as I talked about on Julie Noted, is that President Erdogan, in some ways, has moved away from Mustafa Kemal Atatürk's legacy of secularism and westernization in Turkey. Some may disagree with that assertion. In many ways, President Erdogan is secular and pro-Western, but certainly compared to his opponent, he's sort of moving away from Atatürk's legacy. One of the biggest examples of that is that he is not part of the Atatürk Party that, as I said, Atatürk founded 100 years ago. So this has impelled me to consider who Mustafa Kemal Atatürk was. How is he important not just to Turkey, but to the world? And as I explored more of this, I found that Atatürk has been hugely consequential, again, not just to his own country, but to global relations, and especially we Americans have benefited from the Turkey that Atatürk created. So today we're going to talk about this guy, his remarkable transformation of Turkey after the Ottoman Empire collapsed and that region of the world was in ruins. We're going to talk about some of the ways that America has benefited from Atatürk's legacy. And then finally, I'm going to go a little bit into President Erdogan's, quote, new Turkey that he is trying to forge. But first, in the introduction, I talked about how the vast majority of Muslim countries are strictly Islamic in that they adopt Sharia law, they require women to be veiled, and I said that the one major current exception is Turkey, and that is accurate. But I would be remiss if I did not mention that Iran historically has been, at least in the 20th century, another exception, though that changed in 1979 with the Islamic Revolution. Those of you who have watched Timeless for a while now, you know that I did a history segment on Iran and its 1979 revolution. It is such a fascinating historical event to look at. Sean, do you remember the name of that episode? I think it's probably called Iran 101. Just type in Iran and Timeless. Oh, and Iran. That's right. That's what the episode is called, and Iran. So what happened, to give a little primer on Iran, is that the Pahlavi dynasty ruled over Iran during most of the 20th century. This was under the rule of Reza Shah. So these shahs were very pro-Western and very secular. They thought that in order for Iran to catch up to the industrial, economic, and political advancement of Europe, it needed to westernize. So what the Shah did is that he enacted all of these Western-style educational reforms. He also gave favorable treatment to many Western oil companies. This is what ultimately led, in part, to the Shah being overthrown in 1979, because many Iranian citizens took umbrage with the fact that the Shah was cozying up to Western powers. But another thing that the Shah did is that he sent his soldiers into the street to actually rip hijabs off of women who were wearing them. He was so averse to those symbols of Islam because he viewed them as backward and as a relic of the past that was holding Iran back. Boy, what a turnaround from what we have seen today. Today in Iran, as we know from Mahsa Amini, who is a 22-year-old Kurdish woman who was killed in Tehran for not wearing her hijab properly, if you don't wear the veil to the liking of the Iranian morality police, you can risk being in prison, beaten, or in the case of Mahsa Amini and sadly many other women, even killed. So in 1979, there was this big revolution to oust the Shah and return Iran to an Islamic fundamentalist country. That's when Ayatollah Khomeini came into power, and Iran has been that way ever since. So the Western secular project in Iran failed, but it has not failed in Turkey. So let's look at what Mustafa Kemal Ataturk did differently. And also, you will see, as I talk about Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, that the Pahlavi dynasty of Iran, the Shahs, took a lot of inspiration from what Ataturk did in Turkey. But again, it didn't quite work the way that they wanted it to in Iran. By the way, before I go into this, I have to tell you, last night, like the good talk show host I am, I was preparing for this segment. I was reading up about Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. I bought a biography of him. I was watching videos online about Turkey over the past 100 years. And of course, because our phones listen to us, when I was in bed and I decided to scroll on Instagram, the first video that came up had to do with Ataturk. It was that weird robotic female voice. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? That's in all of the, or not all of the, but most of the video clips that you see online today. And one of the things that she was saying was, or the premise of the video was, did you know that Mustafa Kemal Ataturk was quite short compared to other world leaders? And then the whole video was about all of these other dictators or world leaders who were actually quite short compared to the average height of men around the world, which I believe is 5'10". So I just wrote down a list thanks to this Instagram ad video that popped up on my feed last night. You may find it to be of interest. Ataturk was 5'7". Napoleon was 5'6", Churchill was 5'6", Mussolini, the dictator of Italy in the 20th century, was also 5'6", Stalin was 5'5", Hirohito, who was the emperor of Japan during World War II, he was 5'5", Vladimir Lenin was 5'5", Francisco Franco of Spain was 5'4", James Madison was 5'4", Mahatma Gandhi was 5'4", Nikita Khrushchev of the Soviet Union was 5'3", Kim Jong-il, the father of Kim Jong-un, the North Korean dictator, was 5'3", and Deng Xiaoping, who I talked about on a recent Timeless episode, was 4'11". Probably useless information, but hey, I got us some useless information alongside some not useless information. That was a short segment on history, Sean said. Absolutely. You know, I actually want, Sean, you should write this down. I want to do a show on the secret lives of world leaders, or some of these things that you may not know about them. I've been reading so much about many of these leaders. Did you know, for instance, that George Washington's great-granddaughter was married to none other than Robert E. Lee? Isn't that just amazing? Also, Sun Yat-sen, who was the founder of the Nationalist Party of China, also the Communist Party of China, view Sun Yat-sen as the founder of the CCP. Both parties in China, well, there's only one, the CCP, but both parties that were in China claim Sun Yat-sen as the father of their party. His brother-in-law was Chiang Kai-shek, who was the president of China and then the president of Taiwan. All these really just interesting historical connections. As far as Ataturk, I'll give you one final, perhaps useless but nevertheless fascinating fact. According to some sources, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk adopted 13 children. Some say that it was as low as 8, as if 8 is low. But apparently he loved adopting children, and most of the children that he adopted were girls because he was such a reformist and he gave women equal rights and wanted to present that in his own family. He was also divorced, which is a big no-no in the Islamic world, obviously. He was married to a pretty progressive young woman. She got progressive feminist schooling in London, came back to Turkey, married Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. Unfortunately, they got divorced. But it's fitting that the man who modernized modern Turkey was a modern man himself. So let's go back to the year 1881 when Mustafa Kemal Ataturk was born. This tells us so much about the direction that he took Turkey in, because when he was growing up, Turkey, which was then the Ottoman Empire, was collapsing. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk's father was a high-ranked military official in the Ottoman army. His father actually died when Mustafa was 7 years old, but he had a big influence on Ataturk's life because he insisted that Ataturk go to a secular school. This played a large part in the fact that Ataturk, one of his biggest reforms, was making Turkey secular. Kemal Ataturk was such a good student that he actually got the name Kemal, which means perfect one in Turkish. When he was 10 years old, a math teacher actually gave him that name. So he was born Mustafa, he got Kemal when he was 10 years old, and then actually his last name, Ataturk, which means father of the Turks, was bestowed upon him in 1934 by the Turkish parliament. The Ottoman Empire, which again ruled during the time that Mustafa was a young boy, had existed for 600 years. It was founded by Turkish tribes back in the 13th century, and it was ruled by sultans, which were essentially emperors. Mostly, it was also ruled by Muslim leaders. The sultans were, in addition to being heads of state, were also religious leaders, and Muslim education permeated in schools. Muslim traditional clothing was seen often on the streets and, in fact, very heavily enforced. This is just something that I find to be a riveting fact, that there's a narrative in the United States today that all of human history has been characterized by white people having power over non-white people or dominating over non-white people. They just totally gloss over the fact that Islam, for most of its history, since it was founded in the 7th century, was hugely successful. And in fact, for most of the centuries of the 1000s, the Islamic world actually kicked Europe's butt. For instance, in 1453, the Ottoman Empire pushed into what is now modern-day Turkey, and they conquered the Byzantine capital of Constantinople. They renamed it Istanbul, and this caused the Byzantine Empire, which had lasted for 1,000 years, to be overthrown. People don't talk about this, the amount of influence and power and indeed domination that the Muslim world exerted over the European world. It was only in recent centuries, in the 1600s, 1700s, and 1800s, that the European world sort of clawed back and regained its lost territory and power in that part of the world. But for most of that history, I'm telling you, the Ottomans ruled over Europe, most of Eastern Europe, also the Levant, which is modern-day Israel, Syria, and Lebanon, the Balkans, and North Africa. The Ottoman Empire also put forth huge contributions in math and science. Many of the surgical equipment that we use today was thanks to Ottoman imperial doctors. Also, they made great leaps forward in astronomy and mathematics. So the Ottoman Empire enjoyed a lot of glory. This changed, though, in the 1800s, and it changed quite rapidly. Europe was industrializing. They were undergoing the Industrial Revolution. Also, they were embracing Enlightenment ideas that caused political reform that was advantageous to the continent of Europe. And the Ottoman Empire was falling behind. In 1830, Greece, which was a large part of the Ottoman Empire, initiated an independence movement and indeed gained independence from the Ottoman Empire. This was the first of many humiliating defeats. And by the 1850s, the Ottoman Empire was known as, quote, the sick man of Europe. So we can see that when Mustafa Kemal Ataturk was born in 1881, he was coming into this empire that once enjoyed and boasted such glory and power and was on the decline. There was this group called the Young Ottomans, which sought to reform the Ottoman Empire. In some ways, they succeeded briefly at forcing the Sultan to adopt constitutional reform, but then that also kind of failed. Then the Young Turks, a group you may have heard of solely because of the popular liberal show, The Young Turks. The Young Turks became a big resistance movement within the Ottoman Empire. Interestingly, this is a fact to put in your pipe and smoke, the Young Turks group in the Ottoman Empire was overwhelmingly not Turkish. It was comprised of Greek, Jewish, and Arab citizens of the empire. But nevertheless, the Young Ottomans, the Young Turks, they're trying to make things better within the Ottoman Empire, but the Ottoman Empire was just not keeping up with the times. In 1911, shortly before the outbreak of the First World War, the Italians took Libya, which was a former Ottoman province, ending the Ottoman Empire's rule in North Africa. And in 1912 and in 1913, there were wars of independence in the Balkans, which resulted in the Ottoman Empire losing 80% of its Balkan territory. And then, of course, in 1914, World War I started. World War I was essentially a clash of empires over land and over power. So I know I've said it already, but it really is so important for us to understand that Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, by the time World War I started, was about 33 years old. He had witnessed his empire lose a lot of land. Think about if you lived in the United States and by the time you were 33, the state of California had been given to one of your adversaries, and then a few years later, Texas was handed over back to Mexico, and then a large part of the East Coast was given to, I don't know, Great Britain. That was essentially the situation that Mustafa Kemal Ataturk encountered, and it redoubled his motivation to fix things. He conscripted himself into the Ottoman army. During World War I, he commanded several high-ranking units of the Ottoman army. In fact, this may be a legend, but it actually is corroborated by some legitimate sources. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk allegedly never lost a war during World War I. At least the segment of the army that he commanded didn't lose any battle. So this allowed him to gain a sterling reputation among fellow citizens. I have to talk about the fact, although it's maybe not exactly relevant to this discussion, but I can't talk about World War I without acknowledging this. World War I under the Ottomans saw the Armenian genocide of 1915, fearing that other powers would take advantage of some Armenians' dislike of the Ottoman Empire and bring Armenians to their side. The Ottoman Empire initiated a brutal genocide of Armenians. They either expelled Armenians from the empire or, more often than not, killed them. Between 1 million and 1.5 million Armenians died. And one of the unfortunate things about Mustafa Kemal Ataturk's presidency when he came to power is that he repeatedly denied the role that the Ottoman Empire took, indeed the responsibility that the Ottoman Empire had in the Armenian genocide of World War I. Also, the Ottoman Empire during that time had a historically and famously contentious relationship with the Greeks. A lot of Greek citizens of the empire were persecuted. And then in 1919, when World War I ended, the Ottoman Empire lost, as did the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the German Empire. All of those empires collapsed. Isn't it just an amazing thing to think about that just over 100 years ago, we were still living in a time where there were empires? Doesn't that seem like such a long ago relic of the past? It really wasn't. It was quite recent in our world history. So once the Ottomans lost World War I, the Allies, the British and French, who won World War I, came into the Ottoman Empire, the territories that were held by the Ottomans, and carved it up for themselves. Syria and Lebanon, the modern day countries which were under the Ottoman Empire, were ruled by the French. The French established protectorates over those countries. Great Britain established protectorates over Palestine, which is modern-day Israel, and also Mesopotamia, which is modern-day Iraq. Literally, the British and French drew the modern-day borders of these countries. In fact, there is a laughable but also unfortunate historical legend that some of the leaders of France and Britain, when they were in their meetings figuring out how to carve up the Middle East, one of them made an error with drawing one of the maps, like his ruler went awry, but then he didn't correct the error, and that's one of the boundaries today that exists between Iran and Iraq. It's literally the border, where people live, millions and millions of people where they live and call home. The border was actually a mistake because some British guy happened to draw it incorrectly. It just shows you the amount of power that European powers had over the former Ottoman territories during this time. But again, though, it's important to note, the Ottomans, i.e. the Islamic Muslim world, had huge power up until this point when there was a stark reversal. In addition to the Middle East territories once held by the Ottomans that were taken over by the British and the French, Turkey itself was also taken over by Allied powers. So British and French troops went into and occupied the capital of Istanbul when the war ended in 1919. This was another hugely humiliating event that Mustafa Kemal Ataturk witnessed. Before his very eyes, he saw his empire collapse and Western powers come in and take it over. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk was not going to let this happen. He went into a Turkish province of Ankara, which is in the center of what is now modern-day Turkey, and he spent a few years gathering an army together, also making friends with some political allies, and getting the support of the Bolsheviks in Russia. The Bolshevik Revolution in Russia happened in 1917 during World War I, so that distracted the Russians who were fighting in World War I, but then had to deal with their own revolution. Once World War I was over, the Russians, like Mustafa Kemal Ataturk and many former Ottomans, disliked and had a lot of resentment towards European powers. So the Bolsheviks were very happy with partnering with Mustafa Kemal Ataturk to oust the Allied powers out of the capital of Istanbul. Without Bolshevik money, arms, training, and military personnel, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk and his coalition would not have been able to kick the British and French out of Turkey. But nevertheless, they did. The Turkish War of Independence turned out to be a success, and in 1923, 100 years ago this year, the Republic of Turkey was formally established. Yes, it is true that Turkey had to agree, as part of this end of the war, to fully relinquish Ottoman claims in the Middle East. Yes, it is true that they had to give up some of their islands around Turkey to Italy, which are still Italian islands to this day. It is true that the eastern part of Turkey was given to the Armenians and the new Republic of Armenia was founded. It is true that they had to give some concessions to the Greeks and the Kurds, but still, the fact that Mustafa Kemal Ataturk could gather a coalition and salvage the current country of Turkey from the ruins of the Ottoman collapse in the wake of World War I. That is an amazing accomplishment. Whether you love or hate Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, I think we can all agree that that is a pretty big deal. So now into the next part of the show. Let's talk about what Mustafa Kemal Ataturk did once he was president. Of course, he was the first president of the Republic of Turkey. His main agenda was to westernize and modernize. Indeed, the way that he modernized Turkey was to westernize it. Like the Shahs of Iran that came later, and as I said, drew a lot of inspiration from Ataturk, he viewed relics of Islam as symbols of a backward past. Ataturk thought that the Ottomans' reliance on Islamic law, Islamic governance, and Islamic culture put it at a disadvantage as compared to secular Europe, which at that time eclipsed the Ottomans both economically and politically. So immediately, he called in Western leaders, invited Western reformers from all over the world, and adopted Western-style governance. Kemalism was the main ideology of the Republic of Turkey. And Kemalism was expressed or pictured with 6 arrows, which I'm going to show a picture of. This was known as the 6 arrows of Kemalism. They were republicanism, populism, laïcism, which is separation of church and state / getting rid of religion in all public life, reformism, nationalism, and statism. Those words probably sound familiar to any American citizen or someone who has gotten past the 3rd grade. Of course, they sound familiar to all of us because they are the tenets of American and European and Western society that Mustafa Kemal Ataturk adopted. He abolished the Sultanate immediately upon being president. He established the Republican People's Party, which is the opposition leader's party today that is running against President Erdogan, and he drafted a new constitution in 1924, which established a legislative assembly and gave rights of free speech and freedom of religion to all Turkish citizens. We have to understand what a big deal this was, how different this way of doing things was in this part of the world. Also, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk made the unprecedented move of giving women equal rights. This was not true under the Ottoman Empire. This was codified into law in 1934 that women under the Republic of Turkey were equal to men. You want to hear a fun historical fact? In 1935, the year after the equality of women was enshrined in the Constitution in 1934, in 1935, during Turkey's general election, more female members of parliament were elected to Turkey's parliament than existed in the parliaments of Britain and United States Congress at the time. It really is just amazing. But with every reform that Mustafa Kemal Ataturk made, in some ways, he went a bit too far. This is one of the most common bones to pick with Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. Though no one can dispute that he drastically improved the lives of many Turkish citizens, there were some ways in which, as I said, his reforms did go a bit too far. To talk about this politically, although the constitution that Ataturk drew up did allow a legislative assembly and the presence of multiple political parties, Ataturk was a bit of a contradiction because he essentially had one-man rule. His Republican People's Party was the party until Mustafa Kemal Ataturk died in 1938. And so in some ways, he was talking about these democratic reforms, but he didn't always live by them because he was ruling under one-man rule. Though, this is not so much a condoning of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk's behavior, it is an explanation. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk was ruling Turkey during a time when the world around him was seeing the rise of authoritarianism and dictatorial leaders, which reversed the progress that many countries had made. To give an example, the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, Turkey saw the Russian Empire collapse because of that revolution. Mussolini in Italy rose to power in the 1920s. That drastically changed Italy. And then obviously Hitler came to power in Germany in the 1930s. So Ataturk was looking around at these neighboring countries, seeing what was going on, and he went, no, if allowing multiple parties even presents a slight risk of having someone who I don't like come into power and possibly may reverse the progress that we made, Ataturk said, I'm not going to do it. So he initiated his one-man rule. Again, I'm not in the business of condoning Ataturk. I'm just trying to provide some historical knowledge to you about what he did. This is an explanation for why he ruled politically as he did. Culturally, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk tried to westernize. He didn't just try to promote Western customs and ways of life, but he actually passed laws criminalizing Islamic forms of dress. In 1925, he passed the hat law, where he forbade the fez, which was the Ottoman hat, to be worn in public. That is sort of an ironic thing that Ataturk did, because the fez in the Ottoman Empire was actually adopted in the 1800s in order to replace the turban. The Ottoman Empire thought the turban was a relic and a symbol of a backward Islamic past. So they replaced the turban with the fez, and then here Mustafa Kemal Ataturk is replacing the fez with nothing but just outlawing the fez because he views it as backwards. He also mandated that men wear Western-style suits in public, and in 1934, he passed a law which required every Turkish family to adopt a fixed hereditary Western-style last name. This is when, in 1934, the parliament bestowed a new surname upon Ataturk, Ataturk itself, again, which means father of the Turks. He initiated a huge separation between church and state, as I mentioned. This new constitution got rid of Islam as the ruling religion of Turkey. It was a secular government that he initiated. For 600 years, the Ottoman Empire was ruled by religious clerics. Ataturk reversed this. Also, in 1924, he abolished Sharia law. He also abolished Sharia law courts. In some Muslim countries today, there's about 13 of them that are ruled by strict Sharia law. Iran is one of them. Then there are other countries, such as Egypt, where the law may be secular, but depending on the level of way that you practice Islam, you can take some matters to a Sharia court, and the Sharia court will supplement or even at times replace the secular law of that country. So Ataturk got rid of that. He didn't allow any semblance of Sharia law in the new Turkey. He also got rid of the caliphate. As you know, dear listeners, from listening to my Islam 101 and Islam 101 Part 2 segments on this show, a big part of the Islamic worldview is that the successors to Muhammad should establish a caliphate where all of the countries that are Muslim majority, yes, they may be different nations, but they are all under the jurisdiction of this one caliph who is essentially the new Muhammad or the successor to Muhammad. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk said, nope, Turkey is not going to be one of these countries that is going to abide by and follow the caliphate. This actually, this bold stance that Ataturk took actually led to a resistance movement that almost toppled his power, and some people actually came together and tried to assassinate Ataturk in 1926. But Ataturk's government actually foiled the plan and, of course, threw the assassination attempters into prison. So it's not just that Mustafa Kemal Ataturk took Islam out of governance. He also tried to get rid of it in public life. I mentioned the hat law. Also, though, in 1934, he passed a law that strictly forbade both men and women from wearing religious clothing outside places of worship. So the hijab was forbidden. You can see how the Shahs of Iran in subsequent years gleaned inspiration from Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. I know I'm a broken record, but again, we have to have an appreciation for just how different this was. This was so progressive and reformist of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk to do. Many argue, legitimately so, that he took it too far. At least give people the choice to wear a hijab in public. Don't criminalize it, but it shows you how traumatized Mustafa Kemal Ataturk was by his early life, seeing the Ottoman Empire collapse, seeing Europe come in and establish dominance, that he didn't want any relic that he viewed as backwards to even come into public life. I'll go on to education. I mentioned that Ataturk invited all of these Western leaders to come to Turkey. One of them was the American education reformer John Dewey. He came to Turkey and saw that in 1924, this is 1 year after the Republic of Turkey was founded, in 1924, only 10% of Turkish citizens were literate. That's astonishing. John Dewey came in and tried to figure out what the source of the problem was. And he recommended to Ataturk that Turkey get rid of Arabic script and invent a new alphabet to replace it. So Ataturk followed suit, got rid of Arabic, and he created the new Turkish alphabet. You see from the picture here that the Turkish alphabet is almost identical, extremely similar to the English alphabet. No surprise there, since it was American reformer John Dewey who encouraged Turkey to invent this alphabet in the first place. This did lead to way more literacy in the Republic of Turkey, because this new Arabic script and English is so much easier to learn than Arabic. As I mentioned, 1924, only 10% of Turkish citizens were literate. By 1940, 23% were literate. So it doubled, actually more than doubled. Also, enrollment in primary school education rose by 225% under Ataturk's presidency, and enrollment in high school rose, ready for this one, 1,700% in just a decade and a half. Another great accomplishment of Ataturk was economic development in Turkey. He created a central bank modeled off of the Fed in the United States. He initiated great infrastructure projects. He also created airlines. He established the Turkish Airlines. Anyone who has flown on Turkish Airlines know that it is really a marvelous airline. Also, anyone who has been to Istanbul's airport, I was just there about a year ago when I was flying to Israel. That place is a compound. It is like a futuristic year 3000 compound. A lot of those industrial infrastructure reforms can be credited to Ataturk. But arguably, one of the most contentious parts of Ataturk's presidency, in addition to the ways that he arguably went too far with forbidding Islamic dress and Islamic customs, was the way that he went about establishing a Turkish nationalism. Nationalism is an interesting thing because for most countries, ethnic and civic nationalism are tied together. Because most countries are created because they have a shared ethnic group. This is the case in France. Most of the people living there are French. In Germany, they're German. In Japan, they're Japanese. In Iran, they're Iranian or Persian. It's not a knock on those countries, and it's also not a boon for those countries. It's just the situation of how most countries in the world have been created. So civic and ethnic nationalism is tied together. The United States is one of those exceptions. American nationalism is civic nationalism. That is apropos of our national credo, e pluribus unum, which means out of many one, out of many religions, backgrounds, ethnicities, viewpoints. We are one American people. America has done an amazing job of transitioning away from an ethnic nationalism towards a civic nationalism, though as we see nowadays, there are many individuals who want to make America a multicultural society. There's nothing wrong with America being multicultural. Of course, we've always been multicultural, but really what has bound us together is this shared idea of our common civic nationality. Ataturk wanted to replicate the United States' civic-based nationalism. But this is another way that he was a contradiction. He did this and he didn't do this. He also tied it a lot with ethnic Turkish nationalism. So allow me to expound on this. He demanded and gave a lot of speeches about how everyone in Turkey should view themselves as Turkish regardless of if they are ethnically Turkish. Because in Turkey, there are Kurds, there are Arabs, there are a lot of different nationalities. But Ataturk wanted everyone to be seen as Turkish. However, he also pushed some educational ideas and reforms that made Turkish ethnicity, not just Turkish civic nationality, more of a priority. He established the Turkish Historical Society in 1931, which tried to do more research on the accomplishments of the Turkish ethnic identity, which is not a bad thing at all. But he also, in schools, mandated that 2 schools of thought be taught. The first is the Turkish history thesis, which is essentially that wherever Turks have gone throughout their lives in world history, they have brought democracy and reform to those countries. So it is a big, heavy, pro-Turkish ethnic way of teaching about history. Also, Ataturk promulgated the Sun language theory, which said that all language in the world had a Turkish root. So you can see the emphasis on Turkish ethnicity. Ataturk did persecute some ethnic minorities, especially the Kurds, who wanted their own state when the Ottoman Empire collapsed in 1919, when Ataturk won the Turkish War of Independence in 1923, he pushed hard so that the Kurds would not have their own state. And what he did was that he actually deported many Kurds, during the 1920s and 1930s. He also banned Kurdish language from being spoken in public, and this impelled many uprisings throughout the Republic of Turkey. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk died in 1938 on the eve of World War II, but his party, the Republican Party of Turkey, remained in power for many decades. Actually, after Ataturk died, they started to allow multiple parties to come into fruition in Turkish life. Mostly, though, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk's party was the ruling party, not just of the president, but also of members of parliament. This changed most drastically when President Erdogan took office in 2003 as the Prime Minister of Turkey, which I'm going to get to in just a moment. But first, I want to tell you, I said at the beginning that Ataturk's legacy, in addition to benefiting many Turkish citizens, also benefited the United States. We cannot take Ataturk's Turkey for granted. I want to give you 3 examples of how Turkey in the 20th century helped serve American purposes in the world. First, although Ataturk was dead when all of this happened, it shows his legacy remained. First, Turkey stayed out of World War II. Hitler actually entreated to the then president of the Turkish Republic to try to get Turkey on the side of the Nazis in World War II. They very wisely stayed out of it, which was a big boon to, obviously, the Allied side, the American side, and helped us win World War II, because it would have been a big advantage had Nazi Germany gotten Turkey, on their side. That's the first thing. Second thing, big development. Turkey aided South Korea during the Korean War of the early 1950s. The Soviets and Chinese were providing aid to North Korea, which invaded South Korea. They wanted to unify Korea as a communist state. The Chinese and Soviets were aiding North Korea. The United Nations-backed forces, commanded by United States General Douglas MacArthur, were aiding South Korea. And Turkey was one of those countries that helped the United States in the Korean War. That is an amazing thing, especially because Turkey is right next door to Russia and not far away from China. They're much closer in their neighborhood than they are in the United States neighborhood. So arguably, it would be more advantageous for Turkey to keep the Russians and the Chinese on their side than the Americans, which are a whole ocean away, on their side. But they helped us during the Korean War, which was no small feat. And the third example is that Turkey was one of the few Asian/Middle Eastern countries that has joined NATO. NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was founded in 1945 to form a political alliance of democratic countries to serve as a counterweight to the Soviet Union and to China. Turkey joined NATO early on in 1952 and continues to be in NATO today. Now, President Erdogan has earned the ire of some members of NATO who think that he is not sufficiently committed to NATO's cause, but still, to have such a large country in that region of the world be in NATO, big advantage for the United States. Turkey borders, I want to put up a map of Turkey. Turkey borders Georgia, which was a former SSR that was actually invaded by Russia in the early 2000s. It borders Russia, it borders Iran, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. So talk about being in the hotbed of world strife. Having a secular, pro-Western, anti-communist Turkey amid that volatile part of the world has been big for the United States. So finally, let's talk about Turkey today. On May 28th, we are all going to pay attention to this runoff election between President Erdogan, the incumbent, and the leader of the Justice and Development Party, who is running against Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, who is part of the CHP, or the Republican Party of Turkey, which is Mustafa Kemal Ataturk's party. Erdogan has been the prime minister of Turkey. He served from 2003 to 2014, and then he was the president of Turkey from 2014 until today. He has tried to forge what he calls a new Turkey, It's complicated. He isn't exactly anti-Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. I don't think anyone really in Turkey is vociferously anti-Ataturk because despite Ataturk's failings, and there were many, he drastically improved the lives of Turks, saved it from collapse in the aftermath of the Ottoman Empire's demise, and industrialized it and created all of these great reforms that put Turkey on the map where it is today. So no one in Turkey, or few people in Turkey, are very anti-Ataturk. But President Erdogan has been trying to navigate Turkey in a different, less secular, more pro-Islamic direction. He wants to restore, maybe not as intense of an Islamic character as we see in Iran or Iraq, but he wants to restore an Islamic character to Turkey. Since 2002, he took the prime ministership in 2003. So over the past 20 years, 15,000 new mosques have been built under the direction of Erdogan in Turkey. Additionally, he has government subsidized many schools which are called Imam Hatip schools. Ataturk was very strict that all of the schools in Turkey be secular. Since 2003, thousands of Imam Hatip schools have been created in Turkey. These are basically Islamic schools. In 2013, only 2% of Turkish citizens were enrolled in such schools. By 2018, it's 12%, and now some estimate it is as high as 20 or 25% of Turkish citizens that are enrolled in these Islamic schools. Erdogan has said that he wants to create a, quote, pious generation that will work towards a construction of a new civilization. Just as far as rhetoric, that is a turn from the rhetoric of Ataturk. His educational program also emphasizes Ottoman history and the achievements that Turkish people as an ethnic group have had over the West. In some ways, though, Erdogan has also been pro-Western. He has given money to Ukraine ever since the war that started about a year ago, but he has also pursued familiar and close ties with President Putin of Russia. Now, Turkey, as I said, almost, not exactly, but almost shares a border with Russia. They're on the Black Sea, which is right near Russia. Turkey relies heavily on trade with Russia to support their economy. Half of the natural gas that supports Turkey's everyday activity comes from Russia. And just to show a picture of President Erdogan with his wife wears a hijab. That may not seem like a big deal to us, but again, given Ataturk's legacy of banning hijab starting in 1934, I bet you that's a bit of a statement that we want to bring back some of these parts of Islamic culture to our country. Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, who is the opposition leader who is in charge of Kemal Ataturk's party, he is much more secular than President Erdogan. He wants to pursue friendly ties with Russia. Honestly, that's smart for Turkey to do because they're so close to Russia, but he has been harder on Russia than President Erdogan. For instance, back when there were other people that were throwing their hat into the ring to run against Erdogan, there was one such politician who actually had to exit the race because allegations came out about him having an extramarital affair. This opposition leader, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, defended that individual who is running in the race and actually blamed these allegations on being planted by Russia. That's a bold move for him to come out against Russia like that. And finally, he has affirmed, if he should win, wanting to have Turkey join the European Union, which would surely bring Turkey closer to Western powers and away from the Russian bloc. I hope that you have enjoyed this episode today on Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. Boy, what a figure, what a consequential man, not just for Turkey, not just for the United States, but for our global politics in general. And what a year to do it, not just what a time to do it because of the elections, but what a year to do it because this year it marks 100 years since his ascension to power. Take care, everyone. See you soon.